All right, today's reading is from 1 Samuel chapter 27, verses 1 through 12. You can either follow along on the screen or read in your Bibles. All right. David among the Philistines. But David thought to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand. So David and the 600 men with him left and went over to Achish, son of Moach, king of Gath. David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Each man had his family with him, and David had his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal. When Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. Then David said to Achish, I have found favor in your eyes. Let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns, that I may live there. Why should your servant live in your royal city with you? So on that day Achish gave him Ziklag, and it has belonged to the kings of Judah ever since. David lived in Philistine territory a year and 4 months. Now David and his men went up and raided the Jezreelites and the Girzites and the Amalekites. From ancient times, these people had lived in the land extending to Shur in Egypt. Whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels, and clothes. He returned to Achish. When Achish asked, where did you go raiding today? David would say, against the Negev of Judah, or against the Negev of Jerahmeel, or against the Negev of Kenites. He did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought they might inform on us and say, this is what David did. And such was his practice as long as he lived in Philistine territory. Achish trusted David and said to himself, he has become so obnoxious to his people, the Israelites, that he will be my servant for life. This is God's word.
Thanks, David. And how many of you guys are glad I didn't ask you to read that passage? That's all right. Not a problem. Not a problem. Yeah, so how many of you are glad I didn't ask you to read that particular passage? Yeah, it's got some crazy Middle Eastern names in there. And I thought, so why did I even choose to do this passage? When I was reading through the life of David, this passage struck me. It struck me as a passage that was not very familiar, but it struck me as a passage that has some really important things to say. Now, I'd be curious to know, how many of you have never heard that passage before? Look at that. See, this is not one of the highlights of David's life. It's actually, in my opinion, one of the lowlights of David's life, which is why we never hear about it. Nobody wants to talk about the lowlights of David's life, except for the whole thing with Bathsheba. That was a very famous one, because that's about sex, So everybody knows about that one. But this, you read this passage like, what in the world? What are you doing? And I thought, how am I even going to talk about this? I'm not even sure I get it. And quite frankly, I have run across some biblical commentators over the last couple of weeks as I've been thinking this passage through, who don't want to take this passage at face value. In other words, they try to find a way of saying that what David is doing here is okay. And he's actually doing God's will. And I'll be honest with you, I can allow for some of that. I can allow for that. But I still think David is really messed up in this passage. I'm just shooting straight with you. Okay? And we're going to talk about why. Now, in order to set this passage up, our discussion up, I want to ask you a question. Do you think that having accurate expectations as you move through life is important? Okay, and let me give you a couple of examples just so you can feel out where I'm going here, okay? Let's say you're about to take a new job, and you think you have figured out what is going to be asked of you in the new job. But 2 weeks in, you realize, my expectations for what this job is going to be are wildly inaccurate. Now, is that a good experience? Generally not. It's generally not a good thing. So in other words, it's important to have had realistic, accurate expectations. One of the reasons that we are so frustrated in life so often, I think, is because our expectations are not accurate. We're expecting this, and what we get is this. Another example, let's say you do what I just did. I just moved into a new house. Do you think it's important when you move into a house that you have accurate expectations of the house. For example, I'm expecting that the plumbing will work. And a week in, you realize you can't even flush the toilet. That's not a good thing. Okay? You expect that the roof is going to keep the rain out. And the first heavy rainstorm, you realize it's dripping on your bed. Do you think accurate expectations might be helpful? This did not happen, by the way. None of this happened. Thank you for that. None of this happened, but I'm just saying, I was just thinking about this. I have certain expectations. Let's hope they're accurate ones, right? So accurate expectations to go through, they make a difference. And when your expectations are not accurate, that presents some problems. Now, let's move that over into the realm of your spiritual life. Let's say you began to follow Christ, having been told that when you begin to follow Christ by faith, all of your struggles with sin are history. You were told that when you began to follow Christ, all of that stuff that pertained to the old person you used to be, that's dead, that's gone. And then you get into this thing, and the reality settles in, oh, wait a minute, I got the same struggles and problems I've always had. And you begin to think something's wrong with you. Or something's wrong with the commitment of faith that you made to Jesus. Now, why am I saying all this? Because I look at this passage, this 1 Samuel 27, and I see stuff going on with David that does not compute. This is one of those passages, and I put this up on the screen for you so you can see what I'm saying. This passage is one that shows the kinds of things that you and I are capable of even after we have begun to desire to walk with God in faith. You are capable of some pretty crazy stuff. And you might as well have your expectations right. Now, I'm not saying you should experience all these things like David did. I'm just telling you, let's just be honest about what is possible for you. All right? Now, after having taken a couple weeks hiatus from David, we resume today, as you clearly heard in the passage. Okay? And what have we said about David? We said a lot of things, but just generally speaking, we have seen how David has already been set apart by God and anointed as the up-and-coming king of Israel. And that, of course, has produced hatred toward him from the current king of Israel, whose name was Saul. And Saul not only hated him, he hunted him. Saul was after his life. And so David took to the wilderness. And one of the things that was so crazy that we've seen is that David's character, his leadership gifts are so strong that even as a fugitive for more than a decade in the wilderness, he's got people flocking to him to follow his leadership. And he's got this posse of 600 men and their families and stuff that are submitting to his leadership even while he's a fugitive in the desert. That is extraordinary. And we have seen how David's faith in an ordeal like this that lasts a decade or more, we've seen how his faith shines like a brilliant gem in these moments. One particular example was when he stumbles into this ripe opportunity to end his misery by offing the king. King Saul wanders into the cave where David and his 600 men are hiding, and David has the opportunity to off with his head. But David refuses to take what he considers to be God's prerogative into his own hands. And he says, I will not do this thing. In essence, he says, I will let God bring about my ascension to the throne and the end of my misery in his way, in his time. I will not do it. Now, guys, I got to tell you, that is ridiculously mature faith. Even though it meant that he was going to have to continue to live life miserably for who knows how long. That is an extraordinary faith. But then you get to a passage like 1 Samuel chapter 27, and you find it a troubling passage in which David doesn't smell nearly so good. David stinks in chapter 27. And I don't understand it. This is a passage I have never heard preached, and probably for obvious reasons. Either, number one, we don't really understand what's going on there, or number two, if we understand it at face value, we think, how in the world can this man be called a man after God's own heart? How in the world? Now, as you listen to David read that, did you have that experience? Did you think, what? Am I really hearing what I think I'm hearing? I'm not seeing any head motion. How many of you had that thought? Or maybe you just sort of tune out and you're not really hearing what's being said when we read it. Okay? Well, in this passage, we find nothing but David acting badly. Very badly. Unconscionably badly, in my opinion. But I think it's important for us to confront a passage like this one, largely because it is honest. And largely because of that whole expectation thing. Okay? I don't want you to think that walking with God in experience will be something completely different than you were told. Look on the screen again. Here's what I want us to say. I want us to say that if David had this kind of an experience, how should it shape our expectations about what it's going to be like to walk with God in our own lives? Not that you're going to wind up doing the same thing that David did, but if you can see this kind of stinkiness in the life of a guy like David, why should you be surprised when you have to confront it in your own life? This is my point. Now then, the truth is, it's not all good all the time. Can anybody tell me that that is true? Have you had that experience with your own attempt to walk with God? It's not been all good all the time. And you have screwed up big time. And sometimes for extended periods. Sometimes, yes. Okay? So this is what we're seeing here. The truth is it's not all good all the time. And I think we need to understand this. Now, so in 1 Samuel 27, we see a David that we do not like. I mean, how in the world are we ever supposed to be okay with what David is doing in this passage? Unless you do some sort of a theological tap dance with it, which you can do, and I read commentators who are doing it. You say, this is a man of God? Are you kidding me? And I thought, well, maybe we're not supposed to be okay with the David we see in this passage, and maybe that's the point. Now, here's the last thing I want to say by way of introduction before we actually look at it. It's this. The Scriptures are honest writings. Don't ever think otherwise. They are honest writings, and they show us just who it is that God has chosen to work with. Like David. Like Moses. Do you understand my point? Like Abraham. You see their lives, and it's not all pretty. The Scriptures, particularly the Old Testament narratives, show us who people really are. Even the ones who are seeking to walk with God. And they show by contrast who God is. And you have to ask yourself, how can there be such an amazing God? Why would he want us? Why would he choose to concern himself with a David? Why would he choose to work with me? This is what we learn by reading these honest stories. Now, 1 Samuel 27, verse 1 is where we start. But David thought to himself, one of these days I'll be destroyed by the hand of Saul. That's kind of a negative Nelly mindset. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I'll slip out of his hand. Now, I'll be honest with you, that is a surprising thing for me to hear from David. What has happened to the remarkable faith of David, who would not take the life of the king himself, thus end his own misery? What has happened to the faith of the man who said, I will let God bring about things in his way and his time? What has happened to the remarkable faith of this man? Now he is saying, one of these days I'll be destroyed by the hand of Saul. David has fallen victim to a very negative perspective here. And I'm just thinking, how many of you have done likewise? How many of you have fallen victim to a very negative perspective and just say, screw it. This is what David is doing. That's what he's doing. That's what you see here. Let's analyze David's thinking for a minute. He says, one of these days I'll be destroyed by the hand of Saul. Okay, I just want to interview David and analyze his thinking by asking David some questions. Okay, David, what about the promises God has made to you that you will become king of Israel? Now, how's that going to happen if Saul offs you prematurely? What are you afraid of? God promised you. And how many times have you had this promise reiterated by different people to you, David? Samuel told you when he anointed you. Jonathan told you umpteen times that you were to become king. Your wife Abigail has told you that you are to become king. Even Saul himself has admitted that you are the next king and you are the one who will produce the next dynasty. And here you are afraid that somehow prematurely you're going to get offed? Where's the disconnect, dude? You see what I'm saying here? Those can't go together. But David has concluded that if he doesn't do something on his own time and in his own way, figuring it out himself, like fleeing to Philistia, that Saul's going to kill him. That does not seem consistent with the David we just saw. Now, I want you to observe a clue here from this passage. Just don't answer me out loud. Just think. See if you can figure out the answer. Who and what is David consulting during this period of negative thinking? He thought to himself. Now, what's interesting here, and I might be making too much of that, but I don't think so. You go through this entire chapter and even well through the next one before you see David consulting God in any way about any of his choices during this period of his life. There's no mention of it. You just see David thinking to himself, well, I'll do this and I'll do that. This is what seems to be happening with David. Now, it's probably fair to ask a question at this point. I got to be honest to David. David has been through a long ordeal. Okay, we're talking many, many years of living like a fugitive. Okay, so I don't want to treat that as though it's something small or something light, because it wasn't small and it wasn't light. But let's ask the question, and let's make it apply to you. How long can a person be expected to actually trust? How long? How long can a person be expected to hold on in faith without seeing the promised resolution? What's reasonable? 2 weeks? 2 years? How about 2 decades? Can you hold on 2 decades without giving up? How about 2 lifetimes? Could you go 2 lifetimes without giving up? How long does God expect you to hold on in faith when you don't see the promised resolution? God's perspective is basically this. You hear the words of Jesus. He taught us that people should always pray and never give up. But here's the reality, guys. This is the rub. The reality of the situation is we sometimes get weary in our waiting. And what happens is our faith wavers. And guys, when that happens, we tend to make really bad choices. Anybody experienced it? Yeah. You get fed up on waiting for things to come about in God's way and in God's time, and so you rush into it and you say, I'll just do this myself. And you make stupid choices. This is, I think, what's happening with David here in 1 Samuel 27. And the kind of activity that David gets involved in during the stretch of his life fits really well with a person who is not consulting God or walking with him. And don't miss this. This is one of those things that will slip through the cracks unless you're really paying attention. This was not a 2-day period. Guys, the passage tells us this is roughly about 1.5 years of his life. Specifically, it says it's 1 year and 4 months. Verses 2 through 4. So David and the 600 men with him left and went over to Achish, son of Maok, king of Gath. David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Each man had his family with him, and David had his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal. When Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. Congratulations, David. Good job. You did it. You were right. You said in your heart that if I just go and live in Philistia and serve the king of the Philistines, King Achish of Gath, well, then Saul will finally leave me alone because he'll be afraid to come and find me in Philistine territory. He was right. Good job, David. You are right. Notice taking some stress off, right? But at what price? At what price? Is it worth breaking your fellowship with God to have gotten out of living life as a fugitive? Was it worth it? Now, pause for a minute. Does anybody recall what events were happening in 1 Samuel chapter 16? David gathered up some sling stones and took his sling and he went to fight somebody. Who was it? Goliath. And Goliath was of what people group? The Philistines. Does anybody remember how David spoke of Goliath the Philistine? What kind of epithet he used for him? That uncircumcised Philistine, which was basically David's way of saying, these Philistine people have no covenant with God. He is not their God, and they are not his people, and they have no concern whatsoever to know him and live life on his terms. This was the way David described it. Now, does anybody recall what city Goliath was from? Gath. Are you not seeing the irony here? Are you not seeing the, what's the word I'm looking for, the hypocrisy here? So David, at this point in his life, decides he is going to live with the Philistines in the city of Gath. Yes, those uncircumcised Philistines who have no contract with God. This is where David decides he's going to go hang out. Here is David aligning himself with those very uncircumcised Philistines, those inveterate enemies of God and God's people in Gath, Goliath's hometown. Are you kidding me? Now, what did David spend the next year and a half of his life doing as he was hanging out among the Philistines? It's not pretty, and it's hard to stomach if you actually envision it. It's verses 8 through 12. Let's read them. Now David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites and the Girzites and the Amalekites. From ancient times, these peoples had lived in the land extending to Shur in Egypt. Interesting how you get that little historical note there in the middle of 1 Samuel, telling people as if you wouldn't understand. Thank you, because we wouldn't understand. These were the indigenous peoples of the region. Okay? And whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or a woman alive. But he took the sheep and cattle and donkeys and camels and clothes. So how are David and his men surviving? They're looting people. They're killing and looting. They're killing and looting. Then he returned to Achish, and when Achish asked, "Where'd you go raiding today?" As if this was his Monday through Friday 9 to 5-er. David would say, against the Negev of Judah, or against the Negev of Jerahmeel, or against the Negev of the Kenites. He did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought they might inform on us. Say, this is what David did. And such was his practice as long as he lived in Philistine territory. Achish trusted David and said to himself, he has become so obnoxious to his people, the Israelites, he'll be my servant for life. They will never take him back. He's disgusting. He's foul. He's a turncoat. He's ruined his chances of ever going back there and becoming the king. Ha! Well, this has worked out pretty well for me, the king. Yeah. So Achish congratulates himself for having recruited such an all-star war hero to turn sides and become a player on his team. Nice free agent acquisition there, huh, Achish? Now, this is David, the man after God's own heart. Now, I want to break this down so it's clear, and I'm not sure what else to do with this. This is just the way I understand the passage here. Here's what's happening in steps. Number one, David first expresses a loyalty to the Philistine king. At least he feigns it. 2, David butters up King Achish, the Philistine king, king of Gath, and he requests and is given an entire Philistine satellite city, which is called Ziklag, which happens to be about 25 miles distant from Gath, where Achish resides. And David says, it's not appropriate for humble me to live in the royal city with royal Achish. So, Achish, how about you give me and my men our own city? It's a little bit more remote here, and we don't want to soil your area, okay? We don't want to bring down the neighborhood, Achish. So Achish gives them their own city. And it happens to be out of sight, so Achish doesn't see too clearly what David's really doing. But David continually makes a report to Achish as to what he's doing. However, it's surreptitious. His reports to Achish lead him to believe he's doing one thing when he's really doing something different. So, brings us to number 3. David and his 600-man posse turn thug. They resort to banditry, murderous banditry, killing and plundering. And apparently this is the way during this year-and-a-half period of life that David and his men provided for themselves. Remember before how they turned mutton security agents and they protected the sheep of the great livestock owners of the region? Now they're doing something else. Now they're just killing and plundering. But here's the deal. Achish is also making out really well in the deal because David is killing and plundering. He's looting people. And David is bringing some of the loot to Achish. So Achish is getting richer and richer and richer. And here's what's happening here is number 4. David is letting Achish believe that he is raiding and killing Achish's enemies, Israelites. So Achish loves it. He's getting rich and he's having Israelites killed. But in reality, David is not plundering and killing Israelites. He's killing the allies of Achish. My goodness, what a gig he's got going on. The king is loving this. Now, what's startling to me in this thing that David is doing is people are dying. People are being killed. Which leads me to point 5. This is the last thing that he's doing here. To make sure no one could blow his cover and tell Achish what he's really doing, David and his men kill every living soul in these cities so that there will be nobody left alive to rat on him. Now, how godly does that all sound to you? It gives new meaning to the familiar term backslidden. And it really challenges the limits of our notions, guys, of what we think a godly person is capable of. So this period of David's life is not recorded here for our emulation, obviously. I think it's recorded here for our admonition. Every one of us, guys, is prone to seasons, whether short or not so short, of leaving the path that God desires for us to walk. And it can easily happen when a couple of things happen. Number 1, it can easily happen when we get weary and discouraged and our attitude goes south. It can easily happen when we start looking at our circumstances instead of looking at God's promises, which is such a platitude, isn't it? But it's true. And it can easily happen when we start leaning on our own resources, like David makes the decision, I'm going to live in the Philistines territory, instead of relying on God and his resources. And guys, when you are in a hard period of life, and this is real, okay? And some of you guys are here. I know you. When you are in a hard period of life, when you're in a hard period of life that seems unending, and you feel trapped in it, it's very easy to do what David did. When you cave into your weariness and you give way to discouragement and despair, you are capable of some very vile and shameful things. I'm just telling you, it's true. Now, I got to go down a little different path here as we approach what we'll call an ending to this. I've thought a lot about the morality of David here, and I've thought a lot about who is this guy? Who are these people? And their lives look so different than mine does. And And here are some of the thoughts that I have taken away. I don't know what they're worth to you. They may be worth nothing, but I'm just a man trying to sort this out. The more I have pored over these accounts, the more a picture has emerged for me. And it's a picture of a David who, it's the picture of a David, let's put it this way, for whom the taking of life seems troublingly easy. Everybody with me on that? And this is not the only account. This is a picture of a man for whom the taking of human life seems troublingly easy. Each one of us, guys, and you're really going to have to think to follow me here. Each one of us is far more a product of a culture than we can even possibly begin to realize. And some of what our culture has ingrained in our thinking and in our behaviors is really ungodly. But it's so familiar to you, you don't even know it's there. Let me give you an example. When's the last time you thought about the composition of the air that you breathe? You don't think about it, you just breathe it. Okay? Well, so much about your culture is that way. So much about American culture is that way. You don't even think about it. It's just normal for you. You don't even begin to ask questions, is this a godly thing? Or is this something that needs to be changed? And every culture has been that way. And David was a product of his time and his culture, just like you and I are of our time and culture. And the world in which David lived, guys, was a violent, bloody, brutal world. Blood was shed easily and almost without blinking an eye. Think about this, guys. Track with me here. How many 15-year-old boys do you know that have killed a man? It certainly happens, but you don't know them, most likely. Okay, get this. 15-year-old David takes down, in hand-to-hand combat, the most renowned warrior of his epic. And then he proceeds with thousands of soldiers looking on to take a sword and saw off his head and carry it around and take it to the king Saul, dripping blood. Now, is that a normal experience for 15-year-old boys? Well, I'm just saying that's the world that David grew up in. That's what was normal in his world, in his life. An extraordinary feat, but the bloodiness and the loss of life, that was normal. David did not have a weak stomach when it came to bloodshed or when it came to the taking of human life. And furthermore, David was a guy who, the more you read his story, you realize he was prone to a short fuse. You saw Abigail had to intervene for him last time because he was off the charge. He was out to commit genocide against the family of Nabal because he had been insulted him. David was not afraid to take life. And he frequently did not shy away from using his sword when he was angry. Now, from our vantage point, you guys, we have a hard time reconciling this. A man being called a man after God's own heart, at the same time being a man who so easily sheds so much blood. And yet, that's the man that the Old Testament presents to us when it describes David to us. So where am I going with this? How does this apply? Bear with me as I try to make a stretch. God has much work to do in all of our lives to transform us into the persons that he wants us to be. And that work is slow and it is messy. And David was no exception. Deeply ingrained patterns, you guys, are first of all hard to even recognize as problematic, and secondly, they're very hard to root out. Have you ever noticed that some things which were normalized for you during your growing up years in your family of origin or the subculture in which you were raised, let's say the North Beach culture or the Calvert Beach culture, the Southern Maryland culture, different pockets of the Southern Maryland culture. Have you ever noticed that certain things that were normalized for you in your growing up are very hard to recognize as ungodly? They're very hard for you then to begin to change. Why? Because it's like air. It's ubiquitous. It's normal for you. And for God to do that kind of work in your heart, it's pretty significant, and it's time-consuming, and it's messy as you retrain an entire way of navigating life in the world when you didn't even realize there was a problem with it to begin with. Likewise, there are times in life, and this is on the screen for you, there are times in life when certain circumstances easily trigger a return to the patterns which were normalized for you. Old familiar pathways like drug use or falling into a relationship with a person you're not married and behaving in that relationship in ways that are not appropriate for unmarried people. You can go on and on and on. Okay? Certain circumstances trigger a return to these patterns which were normalized for you. Old familiar pathways, old familiar ways of navigating life in the world, patterns which God would have us uproot and replace. And seasons of discouragement, like David went through, seasons of faith fatigue, seasons when our focus swings back more upon our circumstances than it is upon God, are seasons that are ripe for such reversions. And this is, I'm convinced, what happened with David. So guys, simple message as we approach the end here. We must be on guard against this stuff. In summary, this seems to have been a really dark period in David's life, when God seemed a long way away. And it was a year and a half of outrageous, bloody, hurtful living to a whole lot of people who lost relatives and children. But may I ask an important question? I'll imply a yes. Where was God in the dark days of David? Had God left David? Did God give up on David? And the answer is no. And by chapter 30, you see David thawing again and regaining his faith perspective. So guys, when God's promises do not come about quickly, we tend to come apart at the seams. We are capable of huge undulations, huge swings. I'm not condoning it. I'm simply admonishing you about it. You and I must pay close attention to what's happening with us and run all the more fervently toward God in those times when we are finding ourselves beginning to drift. Do not let the drift happen. Pay attention. And I leave you with Hebrews chapter 3, verses 12 through 14, which I thought really tied things together. Let's read this together. See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. But encourage one another daily, as long as it's called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. We have come to share in Christ if indeed we hold our original conviction firmly to the very end. Hold your original conviction firmly to the end, brothers and sisters. Don't wander. Don't slip. Keep it going. Let me pray for you. Father, this has been a challenging passage for me. It's been a challenging message to try to communicate because I'm not even sure what it is that I want to say. But all I know is it really troubled me. And I pray that you would make it useful to the people in this room. Sometimes I wonder about any of that, but I'll leave it to your hands. Keep us trusting the forgiveness of Jesus. Keep us trusting that Jesus has the best thoughts and ideas for our lives. Help us not to take that back into our own hands. Help us to trust continually moving forward in that regard. Help us to be honest with ourselves about our propensity to swing backwards. Hold on to us, God. If you don't, there's no hope. But our hope is that you are there and you will hold us. Even like during David's dark seasons, you never left him. You caught him and you brought him back. Move us forward with Jesus. Thank you for the Holy Spirit who's been given to us to fill our lives, to give us strength, and to give us wisdom. In the name of Christ I pray. Amen.